What were the Opium Wars? The Opium Wars were two conflicts waged between China and Western powers during the mid-19th century. The First Opium War was fought between China and Great Britain from 1839 until 1842 and was triggered by the Chinese government's campaign to enforce its prohibition of opium. These measures included the destroying of illegal stocks of opium owned by British merchants and the British East India Company. The response of the British government to the seizure of opium was to send a naval expedition to force the Chinese government to pay reparations and allow the resumption of trade in opium. The Second Opium War was fought by both Britain and France against China from 1856 until 1860 and consequently resulted in China being forced to legalise opium. In both wars, the superior military advantage of the Europeans led to several easy victories over the Chinese military, with the consequence that China was compelled to sign the unequal treaties that granted favourable tariffs, trade concessions, reparations and territory to Western powers. The two conflicts, along with the various treaties imposed during the century of humiliation, weakened the Chinese government's authority and forced China to open specified treaty ports to Western merchants. In addition, China ceded the sovereignty of Hong Kong to the British Empire, which maintained control over the region until 1997. History. First Opium War. The First Opium War began in 1839 and was fought between China and Great Britain over trading rights, including the right of free trade, in addition to Britain's diplomatic status among Chinese officials. In the 18th century, China enjoyed a trade surplus with Europe, trading silk, porcelain and tea in exchange for silver. By the late 18th century, the British East India Company expanded the cultivation of opium in Bengal, selling it to private merchants who transported it to China, where it was covertly sold on to Chinese smugglers. In 1797, the East India Company was selling 4,000 chests of opium, with each weighing 77 kilograms, to private merchants each year. At first, opium had been utilized as a medicine with aesthetic qualities, but over time, increased use of the drug through smoking it recreationally increased demand as more smokers became addicted. Successive Chinese emperors issued edicts making opium illegal in 1729, 1799, 1814, and again in 1831, but imports grew due to a combination of smuggling and corrupt officials sought profit. By 1833, the Chinese opium trade had soared to 30,000 chests. British and by that time American merchants sent opium to warehouses in the free trade port of Canton, where it was sold on to Chinese smugglers. In 1834, the East India Company's monopoly on British trade with China ended, and with it, so did the opium trade. Partly concerned with moral issues over the consumption of opium, and partly with the outflow of silver, the Daoguang Emperor ordered Governor-General Lin Zexu to end the trade in opium. In 1839, Lin published in Canton an open letter to Queen Victoria, requesting her cooperation in halting the opium trade. The letter never reached the Queen. It was, however, later published in the newspaper The Times as a direct appeal to the British public for their cooperation. An edict from the Daoguang Emperor followed on the 18th of March, emphasizing the serious penalties for opium smuggling that would apply henceforth. Lin ordered the seizure of all opium in Canton, including that held by foreign governments and their trading companies, known at that time as factories, with the companies prepared to hand over a token amount to placate Lin and the Emperor. Charles Elliot, the chief superintendent of British trade in China, arrived 3 days after the expiry of Lin's deadline and found Chinese soldiers enforcing a shutdown and blockade of the factories. The standoff only ended when Elliot paid for all the opium on credit from the British government despite lacking official authority to make such a purchase, and handed over 20,000 chests of opium weighing 1,300 metric tons to Lin. Lin then destroyed them all. Elliot then wrote to London advising the use of military force to resolve the dispute with the Chinese government. First, there was a small skirmish on the 4th of September 1839 involving British and Chinese warships in the Kowloon estuary. Next year, in May of 1840, the British government decided to send a military expedition to impose reparations for the financial losses experienced by opium traders in Canton, as well as to guarantee future security for the trade. On the 21st of June 1840, a British naval force arrived off Macau and began bombarding the port of Dinghai. In the ensuing conflict, the Royal Navy used its superior ships and guns to inflict a series of decisive defeats on the Chinese forces. The war came to a conclusion with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This was the first of the unequal treaties between China and the Western powers. The treaty ceded Hong Kong Island and its surrounding smaller islands to Britain, in addition to establishing 5 cities as treaty ports open to Western traders: Shanghai, Canton, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen. The treaty also stipulated that China would pay a $21 million payment to Britain as reparations for the destroyed opium, with $6 million paid immediately and the rest through specified installments. Another treaty the following year gave Great Britain most favoured nation status, while adding provisions for British extraterritoriality, which made Britain exempt from Chinese law. France then received several of the same concessions from China in the Treaty of Whampoa in 1844. Second Opium War. In 1853, northern China was engaged in the Taiping Rebellion, which established Nanjing as its capital. In spite of this event, a new imperial commissioner, Yi Mengcheng, was appointed at Canton, determined to stamp out the trade in opium, which at that time was still technically illegal. In October 1856, Yi Mengcheng ordered the ship Arrow to be seized. The Arrow was British registered and said to be harbouring a pirate. Its crew was arrested, and Sir John Bowring, the British governor of Hong Kong, contacted Rear Admiral Sir Michael Seymour of the East Indies and China Station Fleet, which on the 23rd of October bombarded captured the forts of the Pearl River on the approach to Canton, before beginning to bombard Canton itself, yet had insufficient forces to take and hold the city. On the 15th of December, a riot erupted in Canton with European commercial properties set on fire, and Bowring appealed for military intervention. A French missionary was murdered, and this inspired additional support from France, with the United States and Russia also adding their support to the 2 European nations. Both Britain and France then sought greater concessions from China, including the legalization of the opium trade, expanding the transportation of coolies to European colonies, and opening all of China to British and French citizens, and the exemption of foreign imports from internal transit duties. The Second Opium War ended with the 1858 Treaty of Tientsin, in which the Chinese government agreed to pay war reparations for the expenses of the conflict, opened a second group of 10 ports to European commerce, legalised the trade in opium, in addition to granting foreign traders and missionaries the right to travel within China. China was further required to use diplomacy in the Western egalitarian style instead of their normal way of conducting business with lesser states through a system of tribute. This treaty led to the era of Chinese history that became known as the Century of Humiliation. The term referred to China's loss of control of several territories to its enemies after being forced into treaties which they considered unfair. More about that in a future video. Even though the treaties were signed in 1858, resistance to the principles of the treaty continued, including attacks on the residence of foreign ambassadors in Beijing and attacks by foreign soldiers on Chinese citizens. After the second phase of fighting, which included the sacking of the Old Summer Palace and the occupation of the Forbidden City Palace complex in Beijing, the treaty was confirmed by the Convention of Peking in 1860. Cultural relics. In February 1860, the British and French imperialist authorities appointed Elgin and Grotto as their diplomatic agents, fully authorized to represent their government, as they ordered more than 15,000 British and 7,000 French soldiers to expand the war against China. The two armies invaded Beijing, with the emperor fleeing to the safety of Chengde. The soldiers broke into Old Summer Palace, looted artifacts, and burned the buildings to the ground. Among the cultural relics that were looted were the famous Old Summer Palace bronze heads. On the morning of the 7th of October, the French army broke into the Old Summer Palace and began to remove items of value. The British soldiers that arrived that afternoon also joined in the looting, and with numerous precious items being stolen. All 12 bronze statues of animal heads were sent overseas. On the 18th of October, the Old Summer Palace was burned down by British soldiers as the French refused to aid Chinese attempts to stop the wanton destruction. The fires burned for 3 days and nights, razing the buildings to the ground. As of December 2020, 7 of the 12 bronze heads had been found and returned to China. The whereabouts of the remaining 5 are still unknown. This brings us to the end of this video, highlighting a historical era that has helped shape China today. If you've enjoyed watching and it's shown you a little detail of life and events here in China, then your subscribing to my channel would mean a lot to me. Thank you for watching. Make sure you click on the link to the next video, and until the next time, goodbye for now.